The valley was silent in the way that only death makes silence. 19 Navy SEALs lay scattered across the Afghan mountainside, their blood darkening the dust, their radios screaming with static and desperation. The Taliban fighters were closing in from three sides, methodical as wolves, their AK-47s chattering in short, disciplined bursts. Inside the operations center at Bagram Air Base, Major Thaddeus Vance stared at the drone feed with the expression of a man watching his own execution. The SEAL team commander, Lieutenant Derek Hollies, was still transmitting. His voice had gone from controlled to frantic in the span of 3 minutes. Broken arrow, he gasped into his radio, using the code that meant American troops were about to be overrun. We need immediate fire support or we're all dead. Vance's fingers hovered over the keyboard. The nearest Apache helicopter was 18 minutes out. The AC-130 gunship was refueling in Kandahar. The Predator drone overhead had already expended its Hellfire missiles on the initial ambush that had torn through the SEAL convoy. There was nothing left. Nothing except one option that Vance had been specifically ordered never to use. His eyes flickered to the corner of his tactical display where a single aircraft icon pulsed in lazy circles 60 miles to the northwest. The transponder read, Viper 11, A-10C Thunderbolt II, pilot, Captain R. Kale. Vance knew that call sign. Everyone in theater knew it, though most pretended not to. Captain Rowan Kale was a ghost in the command structure, a pilot whose record was so classified that even her service file was redacted in places that made no sense. She flew alone. She took missions nobody else wanted, and she had a reputation that lived somewhere between legend and liability. 3 months earlier, she disobeyed a direct order to abort a close air support run, coming in so low over a besieged Marine position that her landing gear had clipped a poplar tree. She'd saved 43 Marines. She'd also destroyed $2 million in aircraft equipment and earned a formal reprimand from a colonel who secretly wanted to give her a medal. Vance had been told, in writing, never to task Viper 11 for anything without explicit approval from the theater commander. But the theater commander was currently in a conference call with Washington, and the SEALs on that mountainside had maybe 4 minutes before the Taliban reached their position. Vance made his decision. He keyed the radio. Viper 11, this is Bagram Actual. We have troops in contact, danger close situation. How copy? For 3 seconds there was only static. Then a voice came through, low and calm as river water. Bagram Actual, Viper 11, I copy all, send coordinates. Vance transmitted the grid reference. On his screen the icon marked Viper 11 banked hard east and began accelerating. Viper 11, be advised, Vance continued. Friendlies are within 50 meters of enemy positions. Mountainous terrain, limited egress routes. This is extremely danger close. Understood, Captain Kale replied. What's the ordnance restriction? Vance swallowed. There is no restriction, weapons free, just bring those boys home. Roger that, Viper 11 is inbound, time on target 9 minutes. The line went dead. Vance turned back to the drone feed. On the ground, Lieutenant Hollies had stopped transmitting words. He was just breathing into the radio now, harsh and rapid, the sound of a man counting his final heartbeats. The Taliban fighters were 70 meters away. Then 60, then 50. 9 minutes might as well have been 9 hours. But Vance had made his call, and now there was nothing to do but watch and pray that the woman everyone called the Reaper's daughter could pull off one more impossible miracle. Because if she couldn't, 19 American warriors were about to die on that nameless mountain, and their blood would be on his hands forever. The clock ticked forward. 8 minutes, 40 seconds. The Taliban closed to 40 meters. On the mountainside, Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb pressed his back against a boulder and checked his magazine. 2 rounds left. He looked across at Hollies, who met his eyes and nodded once. They both knew what that nod meant. Webb had been a SEAL for 11 years. He'd survived Ramadi, Marja, and a dozen firefights that never made the news. He'd always figured he'd die in combat, but he'd imagined it differently somehow. Cleaner. Faster. Not bleeding out slowly while enemy fighters walked toward him with the casual confidence of men who knew they'd already won. The radio crackled. A new voice, female, calm. Ground call sign Anvil 27, this is Viper 1-1. I need you to mark your position with smoke if able. Any color. Hollis grabbed for his radio. Viper 1-1, we are combat ineffective. No smoke available. Copy that. Can you give me a visual reference? Anything distinctive about your position? Hollis lifted his head slightly. Pain shot through his leg where the bullet had shattered his femur. We're pinned against a cliff face, southeast side of the valley. There's a dried riverbed 30 meters to our west. I see the riverbed. Stand by. 8 minutes had become 3. Viper 1-1 was close now, though nobody on the ground could see it yet. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, nicknamed the Warthog, was not a graceful aircraft. It looked like something built in a factory where aesthetics were considered a waste of time. The jet was essentially a flying gun, a GAU-8 Avenger cannon with wings bolted on as an afterthought. The cannon fired 30mm rounds the size of milk bottles at a rate of 65 per second, and the sound it made when firing was like the voice of God if God were angry and spoke in thunder. Captain Rowan Kale sat in the cockpit with her hands steady on the controls, her breathing synchronized with the rhythm of her instruments. She'd been flying for 6 hours straight, a reconnaissance mission that had yielded exactly nothing except sore shoulders and a bladder that hated her. She'd been about to turn back to base when the call came through. Now she was running calculations in her head, 50 meters between friendlies and enemies, mountainous terrain, low cloud ceiling, no forward air controller on the ground, which meant she'd have to eyeball the target identification herself. It was the kind of mission that could end a career if it went wrong. It was also exactly the kind of mission she'd been born for. Anvil 27, Viper 1-1 is 60 seconds out. I need absolute confirmation. Are your personnel still in the position you described? Affirmative, Hollis rasped. We haven't moved. And the enemy, closing from the west and north, maybe 35 meters now. Roger, keep your heads down. Guns, guns, guns. The Warthog came in low over the ridge, so low that the Taliban fighters didn't hear it until it was almost on top of them. By then it was too late. Rowan lined up her approach with the precision of a surgeon, her eyes flicking between the heads-up display and the ground rushing beneath her. She could see the dried riverbed. She could see the cliff face. And she could see the line of figures moving across the scree with their weapons raised. She squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 roared to life, and the world turned into thunder and fire. The 30mm rounds impacted the mountainside in a diagonal line, each one hitting with the force of a small bomb. Rock and flesh vaporized together. Taliban fighters disappeared into clouds of red mist. The sound was so loud that Hollis and his men felt it in their bones, a physical pressure that made their ears ring and their teeth ache. Then, as quickly as it had started, it stopped. Rowan pulled up, banking hard to avoid the cliff face, and climbed back into the clouds. On the ground there was silence again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. Webb lifted his head cautiously. Where there had been 30 enemy fighters, there was now nothing but smoke and scattered debris. A few survivors were stumbling away, their weapons abandoned, their will to fight shattered along with their comrades. Hollis keyed his radio with shaking hands. Viper 1-1, Anvil 27, target destroyed. You just saved our lives. Be that Anvil, are you able to move? Negative, we've got multiple casualties. We need CASCVAC. Understood, I'll maintain overhead cover until the Hellos arrive. Nobody's touching you. Rowan brought the Warthog around in a wide circle, her eyes scanning the valley below. The Apache helicopters were inbound now, 7 minutes out. She had enough fuel to loiter until they arrived, and she intended to use every drop of it. On the ground, Webb looked at Hollis and shook his head slowly. The hell was that? Hollis smiled despite the pain. That, he said, was Viper 1-1. Back at Bagram, Major Vance watched the drone feed with something approaching religious awe. He'd seen a lot of close air support missions in his career, but he'd never seen anything like that. The precision required to hit targets that close to friendly forces, in that terrain with that weapon system, was beyond extraordinary. It was damn near supernatural. He keyed his radio. Viper 1-1, Bagram Actual. Outstanding work. You have our thanks. Just doing my job, sir, Rowan replied. But Vance could hear something in her voice that hadn't been there before. Not pride exactly, more like satisfaction. the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd just proven something to herself that she'd always known but others had doubted. The Apache helicopters arrived and extracted the SEAL team without further incident. All 19 men survived, though 3 of them would spend the next 6 months in military hospitals. When Lieutenant Hollies was finally stable enough to give his after-action report, he was asked to identify the pilot who'd saved his team. He gave her call sign and the debriefer nodded and wrote it down. Then Hollies added something that wasn't in the official format. "I want to meet her," he said. "Whoever she is, I owe her my life." The debriefer looked uncomfortable. "That might not be possible, Lieutenant. Captain Cale doesn't usually attend these kinds of things." "I don't care. Make it happen." It took 3 weeks and intervention from a 1-star general, but eventually it happened. The meeting was arranged in a quiet office at Bagram, just Hollies and the pilot who'd pulled him out of hell. When Rowan Cale walked through the door, Hollies was struck by how ordinary she looked. She was maybe 5'6", lean and angular, with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun and eyes that were an unsettling shade of gray. She wore a standard flight suit with her rank insignia and wings, and she moved with the economical grace of someone who'd spent more time in cockpits than on solid ground. "Lieutenant Hollies," she said, extending her hand. "Captain Cale, it's good to see you on your feet." They shook hands. Hollies found his throat unexpectedly tight. "I wanted to thank you," he said. "What you did out there, the risk you took, I just wanted you to know that it mattered. You saved 19 lives." Rowan nodded slowly. "I'm glad I was in position to help." "I ask you something?" "Sure. Why do they call you Viper?" Rowan's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those gray eyes. "It's a long story. I've got time." She considered him for a moment, then seemed to make a decision. "I earned it during my first deployment. I was flying cover for a ground unit that got ambushed. The officer in charge refused to authorize close air support because he thought the risk was too high. Said he wasn't going to be responsible for friendly fire casualties. But you went in anyway." "I went in anyway, saved 23 Marines, but the officer filed a complaint, said I had a Viper's temperament, that I was dangerous and insubordinate. The name stuck and I decided to keep it. Figured if they were going to call me a snake, I might as well own it." Holly smiled. "I'm glad you're our snake." They talked for another 20 minutes, and when Rowan finally left, Holly sat alone in the office for a long time, thinking about courage and the strange paths it takes. He'd spent his entire adult life among warriors, men trained to run toward danger when everyone else was running away. But there was something different about Rowan Cale, something that went beyond training or duty. She had the look of someone who'd been tested in ways that didn't show up in personnel files. The weeks passed, and the story of the rescue spread through the military grapevine the way such stories always do. It started with the SEALs, who told anyone who'd listen about the pilot who'd come in danger close and painted the mountainside with Taliban blood. Then it spread to the other aviation units, where Rowan's fellow pilots shook their heads in appreciation and mild disbelief. The gun camera footage from her Warthog was reviewed by tactics instructors who used words like textbook and legendary in the same breath. But the story also reached people who weren't impressed. There were officers who saw Rowan's actions as reckless, who pointed out that she'd violated multiple engagement protocols and put herself at unnecessary risk. There were people who whispered that she had a death wish, that she was trying to prove something that didn't need proving. And there were people, mostly men, who couldn't quite reconcile the image of a female pilot with the kind of aggressive, no-hesitation violence that had saved the SEAL team. "She's good," one colonel admitted to another over drinks at the officers' club, "but she's also lucky, and luck runs out." The other colonel, who'd actually read Rowan's service record, just smiled. "That wasn't luck. That was 800 hours in the cockpit and the best natural instincts I've ever seen. She's not lucky. She's just better than you think." But the colonel was wrong about one thing. It wasn't 800 hours. It was closer to 1,200, and every single one of them had been earned the hard way. Rowan Cale had wanted to fly since she was 7 years old. She'd grown up in rural Montana, the daughter of a former Air Force mechanic who'd spent his life working on planes but never flying them. Her father, James, had died when she was 14, a heart attack that took him in his sleep and left Rowan and her mother with a mortgage they couldn't pay and a future that suddenly looked a lot smaller. But before he died, James had taken Rowan to an air show where she'd seen an A-10 Warthog perform a demonstration. She'd watched that ugly, brutal aircraft dance through the sky like it weighed nothing, and she'd felt something click into place inside her chest. "That's what I want to do," she'd told her father. James had looked at her seriously. "It's not an easy path, Rowan, especially for women. There'll be people who don't think you belong, who will do everything they can to wash you out. I don't care." "I know you don't. That's why I think you'll make it." He'd been right. Rowan had made it through the Air Force Academy with honors, through flight school with top marks, through every evaluation and check ride and emergency procedure scenario they'd thrown at her. But she'd also learned what her father had tried to warn her about: the instructors who graded her harder than the male students, the fellow pilots who assumed she'd gotten her slot through affirmative action, the commanders who gave her the least desirable assignments and watched with barely concealed anticipation for her to fail. She'd proven them wrong, one flight at a time, but the proving never seemed to end. Even now, after 5 years in theater and a record that spoke for itself, there were still people who looked at her and saw something other than a pilot. "You ever get tired of it?" Webb asked her one evening. The SEAL sergeant had made a point of seeking her out after his team returned to Bagram, and they'd fallen into an unlikely friendship. They were sitting outside the operations building, watching the sun set over the Hindu Kush, drinking coffee that tasted like battery acid. "Tired of what?" Rowan asked. "The bullshit, the proving, the way people look at you like you're some kind of anomaly." Rowan considered the question. "Every single day," she admitted. "But what's the alternative? I can quit, let them be right about me, or I can keep flying and let my record speak for itself." "Your record's pretty damn loud." "Not loud enough for some people." Webb nodded slowly. "You know what Hollis said about you?" "What?" "He said you're the best pilot he's ever seen, and Hollis has worked with Air Force, Navy, Marine, even some of those spooky contractor guys. He doesn't say shit like that lightly." Rowan felt something warm spread through her chest, though her expression didn't change. "Tell him I appreciate that. Tell him yourself. He wants to put you in for a medal." "Please don't." "Why not? You earned it." "Because medals mean attention, and attention means some colonel decides I'm getting too cocky and needs to be brought down a peg. I'd rather just fly." Webb laughed. "You know, for someone who saves lives for a living, you've got a pretty dim view of humanity." "Just the bureaucratic part of humanity," Rowan corrected. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sky turn from gold to purple. Somewhere in the distance, an F-16 was taking off, its engine roar echoing across the airfield. "Can I ask you something personal?" Webb said finally. "Depends on how personal. Your call sign, Viper. I heard the story from Hollis, but I feel like there's more to it." Rowan took a long drink of her terrible coffee. "There's always more to it. So I had a flight instructor once back in training. Guy named Captain Briggs. He was one of those old-school fighter jocks, the kind who thought women in combat roles were a social experiment doomed to fail. Sounds like a peach. He made my life hell for 6 months, failed me on procedures I'd executed perfectly, wrote me up for violations I didn't commit. He wanted me to quit, and he wasn't subtle about it." "But you didn't quit." "No, I got better. I studied harder. I flew smoother. And eventually, I got so good that he couldn't find anything to criticize." "How'd he take that?" "Badly. On my final check ride, he told me I flew like a viper, said I was cold-blooded, aggressive, dangerous. He meant it as an insult. But you took it as a compliment." "I took it as the truth. He was right. I'm aggressive in the cockpit. I do take risks that other pilots won't. And I am dangerous to the people shooting at our guys on the ground." Webb smiled. "I like that. Own your nature. That's what my father used to say. He'd tell me that people will always try to define you, try to put you in a box that makes them comfortable. But the only definition that matters is the one you give yourself." Sounds like he was a smart man. "He was." They fell silent again. Rowan didn't talk about her father often. The grief had dulled over the years, but it never really went away. She joined the Air Force partly to honor his memory, to finish what he'd started. But she'd stayed for herself because flying was the only thing that made sense in a world that often didn't. You miss him, Webb said. It wasn't a question. Every day. He'd be proud of you, what you did for us on that mountain. That took guts. It took training and a little bit of luck. Bullshit. That was pure skill and you know it. Rowan smiled slightly. Maybe. Later that night, alone in her quarters, Rowan pulled out a worn photograph from her footlocker. It showed her father standing in front of an A-10, his hand resting on the landing gear, his smile wide and genuine. She'd taken that photo at the air show, just hours before he'd told her she could make it. "I'm still making it, Dad," she whispered to the image. "Still proving them wrong." The photograph didn't answer, but somehow that was okay. The next morning, Rowan was back in the cockpit, running through her pre-flight checks with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. Her crew chief, a wiry technical sergeant named Rodriguez, was doing his walk-around inspection. "How's she looking?" Rowan called down from the cockpit. "Perfect as always, Captain. This bird loves you. The feeling's mutual. You flying today's reconnaissance run." "That's the plan." Rodriguez hesitated, then said, "Word is they're sending you up the Coringal." "That's some bad country." "It's all bad country, Rodriguez." "Yeah, but the Coringal's special bad. They didn't call it the Valley of Death for nothing." Rowan checked her weapons systems display. "That's why they send me." Rodriguez just shook his head and climbed down from the aircraft. He'd learned not to argue with Captain Kale. She had a way of flying into situations that would make other pilots balk, and she always came back. Always. The mission briefing had been routine. Fly reconnaissance over a suspected Taliban supply route, gather intelligence, return to base. No combat expected, just eyes in the sky. But Rowan had been flying in Afghanistan long enough to know that "no combat expected" was military speak for combat is absolutely expected. We just don't want to admit it. She took off at 0600, the Warthog climbing into a sky that was still pink with dawn. The aircraft handled like a dream, responsive and stable, the GAU-8 cannon sleeping in its housing beneath her feet. She loved this moment, the transition from ground to sky, the way gravity loosened its grip and possibilities expanded. The flight to the Coringal Valley took 30 minutes. Rowan spent the time reviewing her intelligence brief and studying the terrain maps. The valley was a nightmare from a tactical perspective. Steep mountains, limited ingress and egress routes, countless hiding spots for enemy fighters. American forces had fought brutal battles there for years before finally withdrawing, leaving it to the Taliban and the Ghosts. Viper 1-1 Bagram Control, you are cleared into the reconnaissance area. Maintain altitude above 10,000 feet. We're getting reports of possible anti-aircraft activity in your zone. Roger, Bagram, maintaining 10,000. Rowan descended through a layer of clouds and got her first visual of the valley. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. The mountains rose like teeth, their peaks dusted with snow, their slopes covered in scrub vegetation. Below, she could see the Coringal River winding through the valley floor. She began her reconnaissance run, flying slow, lazy circles while her sensors recorded everything. Vehicle tracks, building complexes, areas where the vegetation had been disturbed. After 40 minutes, she'd mapped most of the valley and was about to call it done when something caught her eye. There was a small village clinging to the mountainside, maybe a dozen buildings clustered around what looked like a central square. Nothing unusual about that. But there were vehicles parked nearby, and not the usual beat-up trucks that populated rural Afghanistan. These were newer, well-maintained, and arranged in a defensive posture. Rowan dropped lower, zooming in with her targeting pod. That's when she saw them. Taliban fighters, maybe 50 or 60, moving between the buildings with military precision. And in the center of the village, something that made her blood run cold. A line of civilians, bound and kneeling in the square. Bagram Control, Viper 1-1. I've got a situation developing. Possible hostage scenario in grid November Quebec 7742. Copy, Viper. Can you confirm hostile intent? Rowan watched as one of the fighters raised his weapon and struck one of the kneeling civilians. Affirmative. I have positive identification of hostile action against non-combatants. Stand by. The radio went silent for 30 seconds that felt like hours. Rowan kept circling, her eyes locked on the village below. She could see more fighters arriving, more civilians being forced into the square. Whatever was about to happen, it was going to happen soon. Viper 1-1 Bagram Control, we're reviewing the situation with command. You are not authorized to engage at this time. Continue reconnaissance and keep us informed. Rowan felt something cold settle in her stomach. Bagram, those civilians are in immediate danger. Request permission to intervene. Negative, Viper. We need confirmation from higher authority before authorizing any strike in a civilian area. Continue to observe. Roger. But Rowan didn't like it. She'd seen this movie before. By the time higher authority made their decision, those civilians would be dead. She continued her orbit, watching as the situation deteriorated. More fighters arrived. The civilians were separated into groups. She could see women and children among them. Then one of the fighters pulled out what looked like a camera, and Rowan understood. This wasn't just an execution. It was going to be a propaganda video. Bagram, Viper 1-1. The situation is escalating. I assess we have less than 5 minutes before hostile action against the civilians. Request immediate authorization to engage. Viper, we're working on it. Stand by. Rowan's hands tightened on the controls. Stand by. Always stand by. Follow procedure. Wait for authorization. Do everything by the book, even when the book was written by people sitting in air-conditioned offices thousands of miles away. She thought about her father, about what he'd told her when she was young, about owning your nature, about doing what's right even when it's hard. Bagram Viper 1-1, I'm declaring a time-sensitive target and engaging under emergency authority. How copy? There was a long pause, then, Viper 1-1, you are not authorized to engage. I repeat, you are not authorized. Acknowledge. Rowan took a deep breath. This was it. The moment where she either followed orders or followed her conscience. Bagram, I acknowledge your transmission. Viper 1-1 is engaging. She didn't wait for a response. She rolled the Warthog into a dive, lining up her approach with the kind of cold precision that had earned her call sign. The fighters in the village didn't know she was coming until the last second. The GAU-8 roared to life, and 30mm rounds tore through the Taliban positions like the hand of God. She made 3 passes, each one surgical, each one targeted at the fighters and carefully avoiding the civilian buildings. By the time she pulled up, the threat was eliminated. The hostages were running, scrambling for cover alive. Viper 1-1 Bagram Control, you are ordered to return to base immediately. Roger Bagram, Viper is RTB. The flight back to Bagram was the longest of Rowan's life. She knew what was waiting for her, a formal inquiry, probably a court-martial, the end of her career, but when she climbed down from the cockpit she felt no regret. Rodriguez was there, his expression grim. Captain, you're wanted in the commander's office. Right now. I figured. Walk across the airfield felt surreal. Other pilots and ground crew watched her pass, their expressions unreadable. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked satisfied, like they'd always known she'd eventually hang herself. The commander's office was Spartan and cold. Colonel Marcus Hendricks sat behind his desk, his face carved from stone. Standing beside him was Major Vance and another officer Rowan didn't recognize, a 1-star general with weathered features. Captain Kale, reporting as ordered, sir. Hendricks gestured to a chair. Sit down, Captain. She sat. The silence stretched out. Finally, Hendricks spoke. Do you have any idea what you've done? Yes, sir. I engaged a hostile force that was threatening civilians without proper authorization. You disobeyed a direct order. Yes, sir. You violated engagement protocols. Yes, sir. You put your career, this command, and the entire mission in jeopardy. Rowan met his eyes. I saved 17 civilians, sir. 12 women and 5 children who would have been executed on camera for propaganda purposes. I did what I was trained to do. Hendricks slammed his hand on the desk. You were trained to follow orders, Captain. I was trained to protect the innocent, sir. Sometimes those two things conflict. The general cleared his throat. Captain Kale, I'm General Thomas Wade. I've been reviewing your service record, and I have to say, it's one of the most troubling files I've ever read. Rowan felt her stomach sink. Here it comes. You have a pattern of insubordination. You repeatedly disobey orders. You take risks that endanger yourself and your aircraft, and yet, Wade paused, letting the word hang in the air. And yet you also have a pattern of saving lives. The SEAL team 3 weeks ago. The Marine Company last year. A downed helicopter crew the year before that. Every time you disobey orders, people live who would otherwise die. Sir, Wade held up his hand. I'm not finished. The Taliban fighters you eliminated today, we've identified them. They were high-value targets, officers in a cell responsible for multiple attacks on NATO forces. The civilians you saved included the daughter of a village elder who's been cooperating with coalition forces. You didn't just save lives. You struck a significant blow against the enemy and preserved a valuable intelligence asset. Rowan didn't know what to say. Wade continued. However, I cannot and will not condone your methods. You violated the chain of command. You acted without authorization. That cannot stand. I understand, sir. Do you? Because I'm not sure you do. Wade stood and walked to the window. Captain Kale, you're one of the best combat pilots I've ever seen. But you're also a liability. You operate on instinct and conscience, and while those are admirable qualities, they don't fit well in a military structure that depends on discipline and order. Are you relieving me of duty, sir? I'm giving you a choice. You can accept a formal reprimand which will effectively end any chance you have of promotion or command, or you can accept a transfer to a special operations unit that operates under different rules, a unit that values initiative and independent action. Rowan blinked. Sir, there's a joint task force being formed. Small, highly classified. They need pilots who can think on their feet and operate in gray areas. You'd be perfect for it, but it means leaving conventional forces behind. No more flying out of Bagram, no more regular deployments. You'd be off the books, more or less. It was the last thing Rowan had expected. Can I think about it, sir? You have 24 hours, dismissed. Rowan saluted and left the office, her mind spinning. Rodriguez was waiting outside, trying very hard to look like he wasn't waiting outside. So, he asked, so I'm not being court-martialed. That's good, right? Think so, I'm not sure yet. That night Rowan lay in her bunk and stared at the ceiling. The offer Wade had made was tempting. No more bureaucracy. No more fighting with commanders who didn't trust her judgment. Just flying and fighting and doing what she did best. But it also meant leaving behind the conventional forces, the regular military structure that had been her home for years. It meant stepping into the shadows. She thought about the civilians she'd saved, about the SEAL team on the mountain. About all the times she'd been told to stand by, to wait, to follow procedure while people died. The next morning she gave General Wade her answer. I'll take the transfer, sir. Wade nodded slowly. I thought you might report to Kandahar in 72 hours. Someone will meet you there with details. Yes, sir. And Captain, this new assignment, it's not going to be easier. If anything, it'll be harder. The missions are more dangerous, the stakes are higher, and there's no safety net. You make a mistake and there's no one to pull you out. I understand, sir. Good. Because the people you'll be protecting, they're counting on you. Don't let them down. Rowan saluted. I won't, sir. The transfer happened quickly. Within a week, Rowan had left Bagram and arrived at a small, undisclosed airfield near Kandahar. The facility was bare bones, just a runway, a few buildings, and a handful of personnel who looked at her with the flat, assessing eyes of people who'd seen too much. Her new commanding officer was a Navy SEAL commander named Hayes. He was short, compact, built like a fire hydrant with gray in his beard and scars on his hands. Captain Kale, he said, shaking her hand, I've heard a lot about you. I hope some of it was good, sir. Hayes smiled slightly. All of it was good. That's why you're here. We need someone who can operate independently and make hard calls under pressure. What exactly will I be doing? Close air support for special operations. SEAL teams, Delta Force, Rangers, sometimes foreign units. The missions are time-sensitive, often politically complicated. You'll be making life-and-death decisions with incomplete information and no time to second-guess yourself. Sounds familiar, sir. I imagine it does. But here's the difference. Nobody's going to question your judgment after the fact. If you say you had to take the shot, we believe you. If you say it was too risky, we believe that too. We trust our people. Rowan felt something loosen in her chest. Trust. It was the one thing she'd never quite had in the conventional forces. I won't let you down, sir. I know you won't. That's why you're here. The months that followed were the most intense of Rowan's career. She flew missions that never made the news, supporting operations that would be classified for decades. She saved lives in a dozen countries, struck targets that enemy commanders thought were untouchable, and earned the respect of warriors who didn't give respect easily. And slowly, gradually, the story of Viper 11 spread beyond the military. It started with a reporter who'd been embedded with a SEAL team and heard about the rescue on the mountainside. He'd written an article that danced around the classified details but captured the essence of what happened. The article went viral. People wanted to know more about the pilot who'd saved 19 Navy SEALs. They wanted to know her name, her story, her face. The military, in its wisdom, decided that Rowan's story could be useful for recruitment and morale. They arranged an interview with a major news network, carefully scripted and supervised. Rowan hated every minute of it. She sat in her dress uniform, answering questions about courage and duty, trying not to roll her eyes when the interviewer asked if being a woman in a male-dominated field was challenging. "It's challenging for everyone," she'd said. "Gender doesn't make the bullets any less real." But the interview did something unexpected. It inspired people. Young women who'd never considered military service started applying to the Air Force Academy. Female pilots already in the service felt validated, like their struggles had finally been acknowledged. And male pilots, many of them, started looking at Rowan and seeing not an anomaly but a peer. One evening, 6 months into her new assignment, Rowan was sitting in the small operations center when Hayes approached her. "Got a mission for you," he said. "What kind?" "Bad kind. There's a CIA officer missing in Pakistan. We think we know where he's being held, but the location is deep in hostile territory. The Pakistanis can't officially help us, which means we're going in alone." "When?" "Tonight." Rowan stood up. "I'll prep my bird." "Kale," she turned back. "Sir. This one's different. If it goes wrong, if you get shot down, we can't come get you. Officially, you were never there." Rowan nodded. "Understood, sir." The mission brief was short and grim. The CIA officer, a man named David Preston, had been captured while meeting an asset near the Afghan-Pakistan border. Intelligence suggested he was being held in a compound controlled by a Pakistani Taliban faction. A SEAL team would infiltrate on the ground and extract him. Rowan's job was to provide overwatch and close air support if things went sideways, which everyone knew they probably would. She took off at midnight, flying dark, her transponder off, skimming low over the mountains to avoid radar. The Warthog was loaded for bear, a full load of 30mm rounds, Maverick missiles, and Mark 82 bombs, enough firepower to level a small town. The infiltration went smoothly at first. The SEAL team, led by a lieutenant commander named Reyes, made it to the compound without being detected. Rowan circled overhead at 15,000 feet, watching through her targeting pod as the team breached the walls and moved inside. Then the radio exploded with gunfire and shouting. "Contact! Contact! We're taking fire from multiple positions." Reyes' voice was calm but urgent. "Viper, we need close air support on the north building, danger close." Rowan was already rolling into her attack run before he finished the sentence. She came in low, so low she could see individual fighters moving between buildings, and opened up with the GAU-8. The results were devastating and immediate, but more fighters kept coming. This wasn't a Taliban compound. It was a fortress. "Viper, Reyes, we've got the package, but we're pinned down in the main building. At least 40 fighters between us and the extraction point." Rowan could see the situation developing. The SEALs were trapped and reinforcements were pouring into the compound. Within minutes, they'd be overwhelmed. "Reyes, Viper, I'm going to clear you a path. When I do, you move fast. Understood?" "Roger that." Rowan lined up her next run, calculating angles and distances in her head. What she was about to do violated every safety protocol in the book. She was going to drop bombs within 30 meters of friendly forces, in a compound full of buildings with limited visibility. One wrong calculation and she'd kill the people she was trying to save. She thought about her father, about owning your nature. She dropped the bombs. The explosions lit up the night, a rolling wave of fire that consumed the northern part of the compound. Rowan pulled up hard, banking away, her heart hammering. "Reyes, path is clear. Move now." "Moving." She watched through her targeting pod as the SEAL team burst out of the building, carrying Preston between them, running for the extraction point. More fighters appeared, firing wildly. Rowan made 3 more gun runs, each one closer than the last, buying the SEALs precious seconds. Finally, a Black Hawk helicopter swooped in, and the team climbed aboard. They were gone before the surviving Taliban fighters could regroup. "Viper Rays, we're clear, you just saved our asses." "All in a day's work," Rowan replied, though her hands were shaking. The flight back was uneventful, but Rowan couldn't stop thinking about how close it had been. Another 30 seconds and the SEALs would have been overrun. Another miscalculation on her bombing run and she would have killed them herself. When she landed and climbed out of the cockpit, Hayes was waiting. "The mission was a success," he said. "Preston's safe and he's bringing back intelligence that's going to save lives. You did good." "Thank you, sir." Hayes studied her for a moment. "You know, when they first told me about you, I was skeptical. I'd heard the stories, but I figured they were exaggerated. Nobody could be that good. And now I think the stories undersell you." Rowan felt her face grow warm. "I just do my job, sir." "No, you do a lot more than that. You give people hope. Every pilot who flies with us, every ground team that goes into harm's way, they know that if Viper's overhead, they're coming home. That's worth more than you realize." Later in her quarters, Rowan allowed herself a moment of pride. It felt strange, alien almost. She'd spent so much of her career fighting to prove herself, fighting to be taken seriously, that she'd never stopped to appreciate what she'd accomplished. She pulled out the photograph of her father and studied his smile. "I think I'm finally getting it, Dad," she said softly. "It's not about proving anything to them. It's about being true to what you know is right." The next year was a blur of missions. Rowan flew in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and places whose names she couldn't share. She became a legend in the special operations community, the pilot everyone wanted overhead when things got bad. And things got bad often. There was the night in Mosul when she'd stayed on station for 7 hours, well past her fuel reserves, refusing to leave while a Ranger team fought their way out of an ambush. She'd made it back to base with her fuel gauge reading 0 and her engine sputtering. There was the mission in Yemen where she'd spotted a suicide truck bomb headed for a coalition base and destroyed it with a Maverick missile launched from 4 miles away, a shot that should have been impossible. There was the rescue in Syria where she'd provided cover for a downed F-16 pilot, keeping enemy forces at bay until a rescue helicopter could arrive. She'd expended all her ammunition and resorted to making low passes just to scare fighters away, flying so low that her landing gear scraped tree branches. Each mission added to the legend. Each mission proved something that shouldn't have needed proving, that she was one of the best combat pilots alive, regardless of gender or politics or any other irrelevant factor. But the missions took their toll. Rowan started having nightmares, vivid dreams where she made the wrong call and people died. She'd wake up in the middle of the night, her flight suit soaked with sweat, haunted by faces she'd never actually seen. Hayes noticed. He called her into his office after a particularly rough mission. "You need to take some leave, Cale." "I'm fine, sir." "That's not a request. You've been flying combat missions for 18 months straight. You're exhausted, and exhausted pilots make mistakes." "I don't make mistakes." "Everyone makes mistakes eventually, and when you do at the speeds and altitudes you operate at, mistakes are fatal." Rowan wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. "How long?" 2 weeks. "Go somewhere quiet, decompress, come back ready to fly." "Yes, sir." She took her leave in Montana, returning to the small town where she'd grown up. Her mother still lived there in a little house that smelled like pine and old memories. They sat on the porch and drank coffee, and Rowan tried to explain what her life had become. "They call me Viper," she said. "It's supposed to be an insult, but I wear it like armor." Her mother, whose name was Catherine and who'd raised Rowan alone after James died, just smiled. "Your father would be so proud of you. I wish he could see what I've become." "Oh, honey, he can, I'm sure of it." They talked for hours about everything and nothing, and slowly Rowan felt something in her chest begin to unwind. The nightmares didn't go away completely, but they became less frequent. By the time she returned to duty, she felt almost human again. The missions continued. Month after month, year after year, Rowan's reputation grew until it transcended the military. She became a symbol, a proof of concept that excellence knows no gender. Young girls dressed as Viper for Halloween. College students wrote papers about her. Politicians invoked her name in speeches about women in combat. Rowan hated the attention, but she understood its importance. She'd become larger than herself, a representation of something that mattered to people who'd never flown a plane or fired a weapon. And then, 7 years into her service with the Special Operations Task Force, everything changed. She was flying a routine reconnaissance mission over Syria when her aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire. The round punched through her left engine, and the Warthog began hemorrhaging hydraulic fluid. Alarms screamed in her cockpit. Warning lights flashed like a Christmas tree. Rowan fought the controls, trying to maintain altitude, but the aircraft was dying beneath her. "Mayday, mayday," she transmitted. "Viper 1-1 is hit and losing control. I'm going to have to eject." "Roger, Viper, marking your position. Help is on the way." Rowan struggled with the aircraft for another 30 seconds, trying to guide it away from a village below. Finally, when the fire warning light illuminated, she had no choice. She pulled the ejection handle. The canopy blew off, and she was launched into the sky with brutal force. The parachute deployed, and suddenly the world was quiet except for the sound of wind and the distant thump of her aircraft hitting the ground. She landed hard in a field, rolled to absorb the impact, and came up scanning her surroundings. She was alive. She was down in enemy territory, but she was alive. She activated her emergency beacon and pulled out her sidearm, a Beretta M9 that suddenly felt inadequate for the situation. The first 20 minutes were the worst. She knew enemy fighters had seen her plane go down. They'd be coming, and they'd be coming fast. She moved away from her landing site, finding cover in a grove of olive trees, and waited. The rescue helicopter arrived faster than she dared hope, an Air Force Pave Hawk flying low and fast with 2 Apache gunships running escort. They extracted her under fire, door gunners laying down suppressing fire while she climbed aboard. Only after they were airborne, climbing to safety, did Rowan allow herself to shake. The crew chief noticed. "You okay, Captain?" "Yeah," she managed. "Just glad you guys showed up." "Are you kidding? You're Viper. Half the theater wanted to be on this rescue." Back at base, the flight surgeon cleared her medically, but Hayes saw something that the doctor missed. "You're grounded," he said. "For how long?" "Until I say otherwise. You got shot down, Cale. That does things to a pilot's head." "I'm fine." "I've heard that before, from pilots who weren't fine. You're taking a break." This time, Rowan couldn't argue. Something had shifted inside her during those minutes on the ground, waiting for rescue or capture or death. For the first time in her career, she'd felt fear. Not the sharp, adrenaline-fueled fear of combat, but a deeper, more existential terror. The weeks that followed were strange. Rowan stayed on base but didn't fly. She attended briefings, helped with mission planning, mentored younger pilots, but she felt disconnected, like she was watching her life from behind glass. It was Lieutenant Reyes, the SEAL commander she'd saved in Pakistan, who finally helped her break through. He found her one evening sitting alone in the rec room, staring at nothing. "Mind if I sit?" "Free country," Rowan said. Reyes sat down. They were quiet for a while. He said, "I heard you got shot down. News travels fast. You know what I did after my first firefight?" "What?" "I threw up right there in the street in front of my whole team. Then I spent the next 3 days convinced I was going to die on the next mission." "What changed?" "Nothing changed. I was still scared. But I realized that being scared didn't make me weak. It made me human, and being human meant I could still do my job, still protect my team, still complete the mission." Rowan looked at him. "You think I'm scared? I think you're a pilot who just learned she's mortal. That's a hard lesson. So what do I do?" "You accept it. You accept that every time you climb into that cockpit you might not come back, and then you climb in anyway because there are people counting on you." It was simple advice, but it resonated. The next day, Rowan told Hayes she was ready to fly again. He studied her carefully. "You sure?" "I'm sure." "All right, but we're starting slow, training flights only until I'm convinced you've still got your edge." Rowan flew training missions for 2 weeks, and with each flight she felt more like herself. The fear didn't disappear, but it became manageable, just another variable to account for. Then Hayes called her into his office. "Got a mission for you. It's a big one." "Tell me." "There's a marine company pinned down in eastern Syria. They walked into an ambush and the fighting's been going on for 3 hours. They've got casualties, they're low on ammunition, and enemy reinforcements are arriving. The other aircraft in the area have already expended their ordnance. You're the only asset available. Rowan felt her pulse quicken. When do I launch? 10 minutes ago. Think you're ready? She met his eyes. Yes, sir. Then get your bird in the air. Semper Fi, Captain. Rowan ran to the flight line where Rodriguez and the ground crew were already prepping her aircraft. We loaded you hot, Captain, Rodriguez called. Full combat load. Perfect. She climbed into the cockpit, and as she ran through her pre-flight checks, she felt the fear lurking at the edges of her mind. But she also felt something else, purpose. Those Marines needed her. Nothing else mattered. She took off and headed east, pushing the Warthog to its maximum speed. The Marine Company was in desperate straits. She could hear it in the radio traffic, the controlled panic of men who knew they were in trouble. Any air support, this is Raider 3-6. We are combat ineffective and need immediate assistance. Raider 3-6, this is Viper 1-1, I'm 2 minutes out, give me a sitrep. The Marine commander, a captain named Morrison, sounded like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Viper 1-1, you're really here? I'm really here, Captain. What's your situation? We're pinned in a riverbed. Enemy forces on 3 sides, maybe 200 fighters. We've got 10 wounded and we're down to our last magazines. If you can't help us, we're done. I can help you, mark your position. 2 minutes later, Rowan arrived over the battlefield. It was chaos below, a sprawling firefight that covered half a mile of desert. She could see the Marines, hunkered down behind a low berm, and she could see the enemy fighters closing in. Raider 3-6, I have your position. I'm going to make a gun run north of your location. When I do, I want you to pull back to the southeast. There's a ridgeline 200 meters from your current position. Get there and I'll keep the enemy off you. Roger, Viper, we're ready. Rowan lined up her approach and opened fire. The GAU-8 roared and the desert erupted in dust and fire. She made 4 passes, each one walking the destruction closer to the enemy positions, each one buying the Marines time to move. But there were so many enemy fighters and they weren't retreating. They were determined to finish what they'd started. Viper, Raider, we're taking fire from a building complex to the north. Can you hit it? Rowan checked her targeting pod. The building complex Morrison was referring to was less than 100 meters from the Marines' position. Hitting it would require precision she wasn't sure she still had. The fear surged up again, the memory of being shot down, of being vulnerable. She could feel her hands starting to shake. Then she heard her father's voice in her head, as clear as if he were sitting in the cockpit beside her. Own your nature, Rowan. You know who you are. She took a deep breath. Raider, Viper, I've got it. Keep your heads down. She rolled into the attack, descending through a storm of tracer fire, and released a Mark 82 bomb with the kind of precision that only comes from 8,000 hours in the cockpit and a will that refuses to break. The bomb hit the building complex dead center and the structure collapsed in a cloud of dust and debris. Enemy fire ceased immediately. Holy shit, Morrison breathed over the radio. Viper, you just ended the fight. Rowan pulled up and climbed back to altitude, her hands no longer shaking. Raider, hold position. Extraction birds are inbound. The rescue operation went smoothly after that. The Marines were extracted with no additional casualties, and Rowan provided overwatch until the last bird was clear. Flying back to base, she felt something she hadn't felt in weeks, peace. Not happiness exactly, not pride, just the quiet certainty that she'd done what she was meant to do. Hayes was waiting when she landed. Heard it went well. It did, sir. You back? I'm back, he smiled. Good, because we need you. Over the next 3 years, Rowan continued flying combat missions and her legend continued to grow. She became the most decorated pilot in the special operations community, though she never wore her medals. She mentored young pilots, teaching them not just tactics but philosophy, the importance of trusting yourself and making the hard calls. And she continued to save lives. So many lives that she stopped counting, because counting made it feel transactional, and it wasn't. It was simply what she did. But time catches everyone eventually. After 12 years in theater, Rowan's body started betraying her. The ejection had damaged her spine more than she'd admitted. The long hours in the cockpit had destroyed her knees. The stress had carved lines in her face and put gray in her hair. The flight surgeon finally grounded her permanently. "I'm sorry, Captain, but you're done flying combat missions. Your body can't take it anymore." Rowan had known it was coming, but hearing it still felt like a punch to the gut. What now? Now you pass on what you know. The Air Force wants you to head up a new training program for close air support pilots. It wasn't flying combat missions, but it was something. For the next 5 years, Rowan trained the next generation. She was demanding and uncompromising, pushing her students to be better than they thought possible. But she was also fair, and she never forgot what it felt like to be underestimated. Under her leadership, the program produced some of the finest combat pilots in Air Force history, and the story of Viper 11 became legend, the kind of story that gets told in ready rooms and barracks around the world. The story about the pilot who saved 19 Navy SEALs, who rescued a CIA officer from Pakistan, who pulled a Marine company out of certain death. The pilot who proved that courage has no gender, that excellence knows no limits, and that sometimes the most dangerous person in the sky is the one everyone underestimated. Rowan Cale retired from the Air Force at the age of 44, with the rank of lieutenant colonel and a legacy that would endure long after she was gone. She returned to Montana, to the small house where her mother still lived, and tried to figure out who she was when she wasn't Viper. It was harder than any mission she'd ever flown, but slowly she found her way. She wrote a memoir that became a bestseller. She gave talks at schools and universities, inspiring young people to chase their impossible dreams. And she stayed connected to the military community, attending reunions and memorial services, honoring the people who'd trusted her to bring them home. Years later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Rowan received an unexpected visitor. Lieutenant Hollis, now a commander, stood on her porch with silver at his temples and lines around his eyes. "Captain Cale," he said. "It's Colonel Cale now, though I don't use the title much anymore, and you can call me Rowan." They sat on the porch, the same porch where she'd sat with her mother years before, and they talked about that day on the mountainside when 19 SEALs had been minutes from death. "I never properly thanked you," Hollis said. "You did thank me. I remember." "No, I thank you for saving my life. But I never thank you for showing me what real courage looks like." Rowan looked at him. "I was just doing my job. That's what everyone says who does extraordinary things, but it wasn't just a job. You risked your career, maybe your freedom, to do what you knew was right. That matters. It matters to me, and it matters to the hundreds of other people you saved over the years." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the mountains. Finally, Holly said, "There's going to be a ceremony next month. They're naming a training facility after you, the Rowan Cale Center for Combat Aviation Excellence. I hope you'll attend." Rowan felt tears prick her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. "I'll be there." "Good, because there are a lot of people who want to thank you, pilots you trained, soldiers you saved, family members of people who came home because you were overhead when it mattered." The ceremony was held at Nellis Air Force Base, and it was larger than Rowan had expected. There were hundreds of people in attendance, from generals to enlisted personnel, from former students to warriors whose lives she'd saved. They gave speeches about her service, her courage, her impact. They unveiled a plaque with her name and her call sign. And when it was Rowan's turn to speak, she stood at the podium and looked out at the sea of faces. "I don't know what to say," she began. "I'm not good at speeches. I'm better in a cockpit." Laughter rippled through the audience. "But I'll tell you what I told my students. Being a pilot, being a warrior, it's not about being fearless. It's about being afraid and doing it anyway. It's about trusting yourself and your training when everything is falling apart. And it's about understanding that the mission isn't about you. It's about the people depending on you to make the right call, take the right shot, be in the right place when they need you most." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I was lucky. I had a father who believed in me when others didn't. I had commanders who gave me chances even when I didn't deserve them. And I had the privilege of serving alongside the finest warriors this nation has ever produced. Everything I accomplished because of them. So this ceremony, this building with my name on it, it's not really mine. It belongs to everyone who trusted me, who believed in me, who gave me the opportunity to serve." The applause was thunderous, but Rowan barely heard it. She was thinking about her father, about how proud he'd be, about how she'd taken his advice and owned her nature even when it was hard. After the ceremony, as people milled around and talked, Rodriguez found her. The crew chief was older now, his hair completely gray, but his smile was the same. "Captain, I just wanted to say it was an honor working with you." "The honor was mine, Rodriguez. You kept me flying when I should have been grounded." "That's because you never gave up, not once. You taught us all something about determination." They shook hands, and Rowan felt the weight of years and miles and missions pressing down on her. But it was a good weight, the weight of a life fully lived. That night, alone in her hotel room, Rowan pulled out the old photograph of her father. She'd carried it through a dozen deployments, through crashes and ejections and close calls too numerous to count. "We did it, Dad," she whispered. "We proved them wrong, all of them." The photograph smiled back at her, unchanging, eternal. And Rowan finally allowed herself to cry, tears of grief and pride and relief all mixed together. She'd spent her entire adult life fighting, proving, pushing. And now, finally, she could rest. The legacy would continue without her. The students she'd trained would train others. The lessons she'd taught would be passed down through generations. And somewhere, sometime, another young person would look at the sky and decide they wanted to fly, inspired by the story of Viper 11.